I've opened up Unity, and here is the FBX we exported from 3ds Max. And underneath the 4 textures we exported from the Substance Painter. One thing to note is on my import settings, I do not check this, generate light map UVs, because we already created UVs that are unwrapping the whole object. We don't need to generate these light map UVs because Unity will just use those UVs we already have. And generating light map UVs automatically in Unity can give you some undesirable results, and the UVs we have right now will do just fine for lighting. So that's a little tip. Just go ahead and drag that FBX into your scene. This pink material is just the default material that got exported from 3ds Max. You can ignore it. Usually I just drag my albedo texture onto one of the objects, and then it generates a material where I add the metallic smoothness map, I add the normal map. Now this will always give you a fix now little button. Just hit that and it will re-import it as a normal map, which you can see right here. Normally it's on the default, but now it imported it as a normal map, which is important. And hit that to add the emission texture, and now you're set. As you see here, the objects don't have good names. This is because in 3ds Max I had to detach them, and I should have named them correctly as I was detaching them. I didn't, so I could still do this in Unity. I'm not going to do this for now, but that would be a smart thing to do. Just select all of the objects, and then you can, I'll give them that material, type in flora, and it has a very long name that comes from the texture. You can change it later on. So basically this is what it looks like in Unity. Now, first I'll just set it to static, which means it's going to be part of the light baking, which is what we want. Now I have a scene I was already working on where these assets are going to be the last parts I'm going to add to it. And that scene is over here. It's a nice little colorful garden. Just drag that in there. And start just kind of moving your stuff around. Now, because I've detached some objects, for example, these balls, which I wanted to do because then I have the ability to actually just scatter them individually throughout the scene. What can be handy, and let me name this one right now, or let's just say this is the blue tree. What can be handy is to just select these items, these balls, and parent them to the blue tree. Oh, it's a prefab, so it can't do that. So what I usually do is right-click, unpack prefab completely. And then I parent them to this blue tree, so I can just move this around like one object. Scale, rotate. And maybe I want that in the corner there, so I'll move this to the side. Now, when you're working with Unity terrains, placement of trees and bushes and stuff like that goes a little different, and it's a little bit more convenient. But we're just working with custom meshes right now, so it's really going to be just moving all that stuff by hand and making sure it is intersecting with the terrain. So now maybe I want to copy one of these and put them on the ground. And just copy the rest of the objects throughout your scene as you're scaling and rotating them, making sure you don't really see that these are copies, and you can still get a lot of mileage out of just a few assets. I'll just place these objects in the scene, and then I'll go into some of the setup I've done for this Unity scene. And I'll copy and scatter these objects around a little more later on, but I won't bore you with that whole process. For this also, we have these individual leaves. You can scatter them around later on. Let's just name this central object green leaf central, for lack of a better name, and then parent these leaves to that, so we can move it around as a whole. I'm probably going to use this mostly in the water, because that's kind of where I've used most of the green plants, and the multicolored ones are around that. Now I'm missing some of the smaller objects. And they are below ground here, actually pretty small. So there's the ground cover. I've already added a different kind of ground cover to the scene, which is this, which is actually just a flat texture. But I wanted an extra one that has a little bit more of a 3D vibe. And this way I can kind of mix them. This is just a texture made in Photoshop with a bunch of circles and a layer style, some drop shadow. And I made some color variants of that. Little flowers. And then I'm having some, yes, these little mushrooms. And I think that was it. Scale them up a bit so I don't, so you can see where they are. I'm going to copy them around quite a bit to fill this all up. But for now, I think it's good to go into the lighting setup a little bit, which is actually very simple. So for this, I've just used a directional light. The intensity is a little bit higher. I have it set to 1.4, soft shadows, and of course baked, because we want to bake all the lighting in. So that's the main light that's lighting this scene. The other light is actually coming from the Skylight, which is here. You just create a material, and I can show you how to do that. Create material, let's call it Sky V2. And then select Skybox. In this case, I've created a procedural sky. And you see a little render of that sky here. Usually I just make the atmosphere thickness a little higher, give it a tint, make it a little blue. Yeah, nothing too crazy, something like that. This is about what I've used for this sky. You put that material into this Skybox material slot, and you're done. All these settings are pretty basic. The only thing that I remember changing was upping the bounces of the reflection to 2, which just means that if something is reflected in an object and that reflective object itself is also being reflected, that reflection is also there, if that makes sense. For example, there's this big reflective surface here. If we would see something in this which was also reflecting, and that setting was bouncing, was set to 1, it would be black. But because it's set to 2, we can see a reflection in a reflection. Just try that out, and you'll figure that out. So that's really all I use for lighting this scene. And then I've also added some reflection probes, and I usually add them at spots where I think you just kind of do this by look, where they are needed the most. So here above the pool, which is of course a reflective surface, I wanted a reflection probe. A different reflection probe was in front of this little, I call it a sauna. So these golden buttons and these reflective half spheres on the surface have an appropriate reflection. And the last one I've added here above the table, so some of the reflective surfaces on this table make a little bit more sense. You can go as far as you want, but this is really kind of dependent on how your scene is has been built up. So, and I might add a couple of them later on. So that is basically the lighting part. I'm working with 2019.3, by the way, and in that I usually choose progressive GPU. If you have a PC that can do VR, then your GPU is probably good enough to use this. It goes pretty quickly. I set the bounces to the maximum, which is 4. And I usually have all the settings at the default settings. To check my light maps, I render it first times just at a very low resolution, and once I'm happy with it, I render it at the default medium. I've added in some fog, and I made it kind of a funky blue turquoise, I think you would call this color. Yeah, that's just add that to taste. And that's really it. As I mentioned, the UVs we created for the materials will automatically be used for light mapping as well. And if you want to see, go here under shaded, go to bake light map to see if it's all working properly. And let me just render it at a very low resolution for now. Most of this scene had already been baked. But here you can see, and it's actually, because it's a progressive light mapper, it will start to render the parts you see in your viewport first. And here you start to see everything being light mapped. This is a good way to check if everything's going correctly, if the UVs are being picked up, that you haven't forgotten any areas. But this is kind of what it should look like. And this is also a way to see if you forgot to set some things to static, because then there will just remain kind of the transparent wireframe look here. But it seems that I've set everything to static and it's all rendering. And this is where you can really see those bounces, kind of giving that the bouncing the color of that tent, which kind of gives it that warm look when you're inside of this little space. Yeah, this is pretty straightforward. Whoops. Let me go back to shaded mode. It's a little sluggish because, of course, it's taking some compute power. But as you can see, the GPU does it pretty quickly. It's only like 40 seconds now. So we're just discussing the light sources I'm using. What I forgot to mention, there's also some emissive materials. So for example, in this little sauna area, this area here is also set to an emissive material. So this is, of course, also a light source in this scene. Okay, we're almost done. I'm just going to wait for it to finish. And finally, after the light baking is done, it renders your reflection probes. Imports the light maps. The reflection probes. And you're done. So yes, this emissive material here is also baking, and just make sure that with the emission map, this is set to baked, which I think by default it is, but it's a good thing to check. Otherwise, you can see this also when you turn on the bake light map. So this is kind of the basic setup for lighting that I have. And the other thing would be good to mention is the post effects. So for post effects, what you do is you add a post process volume to the scene very quickly. You set it to global, and I'm not sure why this happened. You give it its own layer. I thought I actually called this post, but probably some project settings got overwritten when I imported some other assets. Doesn't matter as long as it's not on the default layer. Just give it its own layer. Create a profile. Make the settings and make sure that on your camera there's a post-process layer where you select the correct layer where you put your post-process volume. And then you just basically do the settings the way you want them. I used to use quite a lot of ambient occlusion, but I kind of stopped doing that because I kind of stopped really liking the look of it. And as you saw in the Substance Painter part, a lot of the ambient occlusion is already kind of baked into the textures. You could have ambient occlusion be baked in your light mapping as well, but again, it's kind of a taste thing. I don't really like that look too much. I think it's a little cleaner if you just do it in the textures. So I don't do the ambient occlusion in post anymore, but I do add a little bloom. I'm not sure why it's not. I don't think I'm seeing the post effect right now. But it's very simple. I just add a little bloom. It's very subtle. Some color grading. Maybe make the temperature a little warmer. I do set the mode to high definition, tone mapping mode to neutral. Just kind of evens out the colors a little bit more. Make sure you don't get those like 100% white colors. Kind of flattens it out. And I usually just kind of play with these trackballs. So, and that's really just dependent on the colors that I'm using in my scene. There's no real rule for this. The lift is for the darkest portions, the mid-range tones, and the lightest portions. So I would suggest you just play around with that a little bit, but make sure you don't overdo it. I have auto exposure on, but honestly, I'm not even sure if it's doing that much in a scene like this. So also, yeah, the most of the look and feel of this just comes from a very basic lighting setup in Unity, and it's mostly the colors and kind of the gradients I create in Substance Painter. Yeah, so this is basically how I set up a scene. I'm going to be scattering these newly created assets throughout the scene a little bit more, and that's pretty much it.